The townsfolk would often say there was something different about Jack Turner's land, something sacred, but they could never quite put their finger on it. Some swore the crops grew greener on his soil, while others said the wind felt gentler as it passed through the tall wheat. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. Not until the day black government SUVs rolled down that quiet dirt road and stopped at Jack's front gate. What happened on that day would leave the entire town breathless, but that's not where this story begins. No, it begins with a quiet man, a broken fence, and a decision that would change countless lives. Jack Turner was no stranger to hard work. At 58, his hands were calloused like weathered leather, shaped by decades of sewing, fixing, and fighting against time and weather. Widowed young and childless, he'd learned to live with silence, filling the empty rooms of his farmhouse with routine instead of voices. Every morning before dawn, Jack would wake to the rooster's crow, pull on his worn boots, and shuffle down the wooden steps with a mug of black coffee in hand. The farm didn't run on modern machines or hired help. It ran on Jack's grit and the memory of people he'd lost. In his living room above the mantel hung two portraits. One was of his father in a World War II uniform, eyes steady, lips tight. The other was his son, Jesse, smiling wide in a Marine Corps photo taken just weeks before his final deployment. Jack never spoke much about Jesse's death in Afghanistan, but every Memorial Day he'd kneel by the flagpole in the front yard, hands clasped, head bowed, lips whispering a name only the wind could hear. His grief had settled into the wood of the house, deep and quiet like a tree root. Despite the solitude, Jack's farm was never truly still. The land was alive with the hum of bees, the rustle of corn stalks, and the creak of the old barn. Animals knew him. Deer would graze by the fence without fear, and barn cats found his lap a safe place to sleep. He didn't own a TV, and his radio rarely left the classic country station. Life was predictable, just the way Jack liked it. But comfort has a funny way of hiding what's coming. It started with a strange chill that morning, a late October frost that clung to the fence rails and turned the grass silver. Jack stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in flannel, and paused. The sunrise should have calmed him, but something felt off. His dog, Harley, barked once, then stood still, ears high. Jack followed the sound to the edge of his property and noticed the broken lock on the barn door, a boot print in the mud. Someone was inside. What he found behind that door would unravel everything he thought he knew about purpose, sacrifice, and second chances. Jack Turner stood on the porch of his small farmhouse, staring out at the wide, empty fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the distant hills, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. It was a peaceful scene, one that had greeted him every day for the last 35 years. But tonight, there was something different in the air. A sense of change, something Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. He shifted his weight, his old boots creaking on the wooden boards beneath him. The wind was picking up, carrying the faint scent of rain and dust, the kind of storm that brewed silently in the distance before it swept in with full force. Jack had always been a man of few words, preferring the quiet company of the land to the noise of people. But even now, with all his years of hard work and solitude, something inside him stirred, a feeling that something was about to happen. He just didn't know what. As the evening light dimmed, Jack's thoughts drifted back to his late wife, Anne. She had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void in his heart that he filled with long hours on the farm and the steady rhythm of daily chores. She had been the one to encourage him to open up to the world around him, to take risks, to help others. But now, with her gone, Jack had become more withdrawn. His life had settled into a routine as predictable as the changing seasons, and he was okay with that. He had his farm, his memories, and the occasional visit from the neighbors. That was enough. But then came the war. Jack's son, Ethan, had enlisted in the military just a few years before the war in Afghanistan had torn through their lives. Ethan was everything Jack had hoped for in a son, strong, courageous, full of heart. He was just like Jack had been when he was younger, eager to prove himself. And Jack had been proud, so proud of Ethan's commitment to serving his country. But that pride turned to anguish when he received the news that Ethan had died in the line of duty. The day Jack buried his son, he made a vow. He promised to never forget the sacrifices made by the men and women who served their country. He didn't know how or why, but he felt that it was his duty to honor them. But in the years since Ethan's death, Jack had been haunted by the thought that maybe he hadn't done enough. Maybe he should have done more. Tonight, though, as he looked out at the fields that had been his life for so long, he didn't feel the burden of loss as heavily. Instead, there was a flicker of something else, a flicker of hope. Jack didn't know it yet, but that hope would soon be tested in a way he never expected. The faint sound of a car engine cut through the quiet evening air. It was distant at first, but it grew steadily louder until a dust-covered truck appeared at the end of his long driveway. Jack didn't recognize the vehicle, but he wasn't one to turn away visitors. He watched as the truck slowed to a stop, the dust cloud settling around it like a fog. The door creaked open, and out stepped a man, young, disheveled, and weary. The man looked around, taking in the sight of the farmhouse and the surrounding land. Then, as if by instinct, he walked toward Jack's porch. Jack stood there watching him approach, wondering what kind of man would show up at his door after dark, covered in dirt and with no sign of where he had come from. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Something was different about this stranger, something that would change the course of his life forever. And as the man stepped onto the porch, Jack's instinct told him that this was no ordinary visitor. Jack stepped cautiously toward the barn door, his boots crunching against the frost beneath him. His heart quickened with each step, his mind racing. It wasn't uncommon for people to seek shelter in his barn during storms, but something about this felt different. He pushed the door open slowly, the creaking hinges barely audible. The dim light from the overcast sky filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. In the corner of the barn, a man was huddled, wrapped in a tattered coat, his face obscured by the brim of a faded baseball cap. "Hey there," Jack called out, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "You need help." The man didn't respond at first, and Jack took a step closer. As he did, the stranger lifted his head, revealing a pair of weary eyes, the weight of years of suffering visible in them. He looked no older than 25, but there was something about his demeanor that made him seem much older. The man's face was scruffy, his hair tangled, and his clothes were torn. Jack hesitated for a moment, then approached the man squatting down beside him. "You all right?" The stranger's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to stay warm." Jack nodded, recognizing the signs of exhaustion and hunger. He had seen too many people like this, men who had fought for something, only to return home broken and forgotten. "Come inside," Jack offered, standing up and extending a hand. "I've got some food and a warm place to sleep." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. Jack noticed the way his hands trembled. "It's safe," Jack assured him. "You won't be a bother. I've seen my share of storms." With a grunt, the man slowly stood, accepting Jack's help. His movements were stiff, as if every joint in his body was sore from the weight of something unseen. Jack guided him toward the farmhouse, but as they walked, the stranger muttered something Jack couldn't quite make out. "What was that?" Jack asked, pausing in his tracks. The man stopped, shaking his head. "I said, I'm a veteran. I was in Afghanistan." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His son had been in Afghanistan, too. Jack's heart ached, but he swallowed the pain, focusing instead on the man before him. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" The stranger looked up at him, a flicker of something, resentment perhaps, flashed across his face. "Yeah, it feels like it never ends." Jack simply nodded, his hand resting gently on the man's shoulder. "Well, you're here now, and that's enough." The man's eyes softened, the edge of pain in them dulling just a little. "I'm Ben," he said quietly. "Ben Harper." "Jack Turner," Jack replied with a kind smile. "And you're welcome here, Ben." Days passed and Ben began to open up. Jack found himself drawn to the young veteran's story, a story of loss, of war, and the aftermath that had left him with nowhere to go. Ben had lost his family in a car accident shortly after his return from deployment. The trauma had been too much. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the feeling of being abandoned by the country he'd fought for, it all weighed on him, and he had no way to cope. Jack listened intently, offering quiet comfort when necessary, but mostly he just let Ben talk. Jack knew something had to change for men like Ben. He couldn't just sit back and watch these soldiers, these heroes, suffer in silence. It had been nearly a year since Jack's son, Jesse, had passed, and the grief still felt fresh, like an open wound. But Jesse had died fighting for freedom. Jack had to honor that somehow. He couldn't ignore what was happening to these men who had fought for the same cause. One evening, as the two sat around the small kitchen table, Jack broached the subject. "Ben, how would you feel about helping me build something? Something for veterans like you?" Ben looked up, his brow furrowed. "Build what?" "A shelter," Jack said. "For veterans, a place to call home, a place where they don't have to feel forgotten." Ben looked at him as though Jack had just suggested they build a spaceship. "You really think people would come?" "I know they would," Jack replied firmly. "You're not the only one out there, Ben. There are a lot of men and women who need a place like this. They need somewhere safe to heal, and I'm willing to give what I have to make that happen." Ben was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching Jack's face. He seemed to weigh the idea, the thought of hope flickering across his face. "You really want to help us, all of us?" Jack nodded, his voice steady. "I've got the land and I've got the will, I just need the help." Ben hesitated again, then slowly nodded. "I'll help you, Jack, but it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of people, and a lot of money." Jack's face grew serious. "I don't care how much it takes." That night, Jack lay awake long after Ben had gone to sleep. The idea of building something so monumental, so important, seemed impossible. But he couldn't shake the thought of Jesse and the other veterans, men who had been forgotten. The thought of leaving them to suffer in silence didn't sit well with him. The next morning, Jack drove to the local bank. He was nervous, but he knew what he had to do. He walked into Mr. Langford's office, sat down, and explained his plan. Langford's face was unreadable as Jack spoke. When he was done, the banker leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You want to mortgage your farm, Jack?" Langford asked. "For a shelter?" Jack nodded, his hands clenched tightly together. "I can't sit by and watch this happen. I have the land. It's not worth much, but it's all I have." Langford shook his head. "It's risky, Jack, very risky. You don't know what you're getting into." "I'm not asking for your approval," Jack said, his voice firm. "I'm asking for the loan." Langford stared at him for a long moment, then finally relented. "I'll approve it, but you need to understand. If this doesn't work, you'll lose everything." Jack nodded, standing up. "I understand." Construction of the shelter began almost immediately. Ben, along with a few other veterans Jack had met, joined the project. They worked long hours, hammering nails, hauling lumber, and digging trenches for plumbing. Jack's friends in the town couldn't understand what he was doing. They thought he was crazy. "You're risking everything for a bunch of strangers," they'd say. "What's the point?" Jack didn't have an answer for them. He didn't need one. He knew why he was doing it. For Jesse, for Ben, for all the men and women who came back from war only to be left behind. One evening, Sarah Lawson, a nurse from the local clinic, stopped by with a box of donated medical supplies. She had heard about the shelter and wanted to help. Jack thanked her, and she stayed to chat for a while. "I still think you're crazy," she said with a smile, "but I admire what you're doing." Jack chuckled. "I'm not asking anyone to admire me. I'm just doing what feels right." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you need anything at all, let me know." Jack smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Sarah, I might take you up on that." Days turned into weeks and the shelter began to take shape. Word spread through the town, and soon more veterans showed up, eager to help. They worked side by side with Jack, not out of obligation but because they believed in what he was doing. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a symbol, a place where they could heal, where they could find a second chance. But despite the progress, doubts lingered. Jack had mortgaged his farm and the money was running low. The local bank had sent him a letter. His mortgage payments were overdue. Jack was worried. He had a hard time asking for help, and now he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat outside, his hands resting on his knees. He felt the burden of the entire project, of the veterans, of the community, of his own fears, sinking in. Ben sat beside him, silent. "Jack," Ben said quietly, "this will work. I believe in you." Jack didn't respond at first. He just stared out at the land, his heart heavy. "I hope you're right, Ben." The days blurred together, each one feeling like a marathon of sweat and dust. The shelter, once just an idea, was now something real. The skeleton of the building was visible, rough-hewn walls standing tall where once there had only been empty fields. It wasn't much, just a modest structure with a few rooms, but it had heart. And that heart was made up of men who had fought for their country and now fought just as hard to build something that could help others like them. Jack stood back one afternoon, his eyes scanning the progress. Ben was nailing the roof beams into place, his movements deliberate and steady. It wasn't just construction for Ben, it was catharsis. Every hammer strike felt like a release. Jack saw the change in Ben over the past few months. The man who had once been broken, a shadow of himself, was now a man with purpose. That alone made the sacrifice worth it. They had their first residence before the shelter was even finished. Tony, a Vietnam vet with graying hair and a permanent limp, had shown up one morning, looking lost but determined. Jack had offered him a bed and a warm meal without hesitation. It wasn't much, but it was something, and that was more than Tony had in the last 5 years. Then came Miguel, an Iraq War vet who had seen things no one should ever see. His eyes were haunted, but there was a fire in them that Jack couldn't ignore. Miguel had shown up with little more than a backpack and the clothes on his back. Jack had offered him a place to stay, just as he had with Tony. The last to arrive was Clara, a young Air Force medic who had been discharged after a combat injury left her unable to continue her service. She was quiet, reserved, and spoke little about the war, but when she met Ben, something shifted. The two of them, veterans of different conflicts, found a bond in shared silence. As the shelter began to take shape, more people from the town started offering help. They brought in food, donated materials, and volunteered to work on weekends. Sarah Lawson, the nurse who had once thought Jack was crazy, now brought medical supplies regularly. The local diner even started donating hot meals on Sundays. Jack stood outside one evening, watching as the veterans worked together. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And in that moment, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Jack knew the shelter wasn't just a building. It was a new beginning for all of them. Everything wasn't as perfect as it seemed, though. As the shelter neared completion, Jack found himself staring at the piles of overdue bills and notices from the bank. He had borrowed everything he could, using his farm as collateral, but the money wasn't enough to finish what he had started. The donations, while appreciated, didn't cover all the costs. The shelter needed more materials, more supplies, more time. Jack was running on fumes, and he knew it. One evening, after another long day of work, Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bank statement in front of him. The numbers blurred together. His mind was racing. He could feel the walls closing in. Ben walked in, holding a crate of donated canned goods. When he saw Jack's face, his expression softened. "You look like you've been running a marathon," Ben said, setting the crate down. Jack ran a hand through his hair, rubbing his face as if trying to erase the worry lines. "It's getting tough, Ben. The bank's breathing down my neck. I'm behind on the mortgage and the shelter still isn't finished." Ben sat across from him, leaning forward with a thoughtful expression. "We'll figure something out," he said, his voice steady. "You've already done so much. This isn't just about you anymore, Jack. You're not alone." But Jack couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. If he couldn't find a way to keep the shelter going, all of this, the land, the farm, the people he had helped, would be lost. The next day, Jack drove into town to see Mr. Langford, the banker. As much as he hated the idea, Jack knew there was no other option. He had to face the reality that he might lose everything. "I need more time," Jack said, sitting across from Langford. "I just need a few more months." Langford sighed, flipping through some paperwork on his desk. "Jack, I'm not sure there's much I can do. You're already behind on your payments." Jack's chest tightened. "I'll get it, I swear, just a little more time." Langford shook his head, looking up with a solemn expression. "I don't know if that's enough, Jack. You're risking everything, and for what? A shelter." Jack stood up, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I'm not just building a shelter, Langford. I'm building a future for them, for me. You wouldn't understand." Langford didn't reply, but the look in his eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. The bank would be coming for the farm soon, and Jack had no way to stop it. The following morning, Jack woke to an unexpected sight. Black SUVs lined up at the end of his driveway. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wondered if he was imagining things. But the SUVs were real, and they were parked in a way that made it clear they weren't there for a casual visit. Ben, who had been working in the field, noticed the vehicles too. He dropped his tools and walked over to Jack, his expression unreadable. "What do you think that's about?" he asked quietly. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the vehicles, his steps slow, almost cautious. He felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. As he neared the SUVs, the doors opened and a group of men in suits stepped out. They looked out of place in the rural setting, too polished, too serious. A tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense look stepped forward. "Mr. Turner?" she asked, her voice authoritative but not unkind. "That's me," Jack replied, his voice tight. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Agent Meredith Shaw," she said, offering her hand, which Jack shook hesitantly. "We're with the Department of Veterans Affairs." Jack felt a flutter of confusion in his chest. "What does the VA want with me?" "We've been investigating your shelter, Mr. Turner," Agent Shaw said, her eyes scanning the area as if taking in every detail. "We're impressed with what you've done here." Jack blinked. "Impressed? You've been watching us." Agent Shaw nodded. "We've had our eyes on you for a while, Jack. What you're doing here is remarkable. In fact, it's exactly the kind of initiative the VA wants to support. Jack's head spun. You want to support us, but I'm barely holding on this farm, this shelter, it's all on the line. We're aware, Shaw said, her tone softening. And that's why we're here. We've decided to offer you a full grant to finish this shelter, along with support for the veterans here. Jack's mouth went dry. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A grant. Yes, Shaw said, her voice calm. We've been reviewing your work, and we believe this is exactly the kind of program veterans need. We're offering you full funding for the shelter, including support for your mortgage payments. You'll also be granted nonprofit status under federal protection. Jack stared at her, his mind racing. But why? Because, Shaw said with a faint smile, it's the right thing to do. You've done something extraordinary here, Jack. You've given these men and women a chance when the world forgot them, and we want to make sure that this shelter can keep going for as long as it's needed. Ben, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This is real, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Agent Shaw nodded. It's real. Jack couldn't speak for a moment. He felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, but at the same time, a part of him couldn't quite believe it. How could things change so quickly? You don't know what this means, Jack said hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. You don't know how much I've sacrificed to get here. We do, Shaw replied gently, and we're here to make sure your sacrifice means something. This is only the beginning, Jack. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The sudden influx of funds from the Department of Veterans Affairs allowed Jack to finally breathe a little easier. With the grant, he was able to finish the shelter, pay off his mortgage, and secure the future of the farm. But it wasn't just the financial relief that had changed everything. It was the feeling of purpose that had settled over him and the other veterans. The shelter wasn't just a roof over their heads, it was a community. There were now more veterans coming in, and each person brought with them a story, a struggle, and a history that Jack felt connected to. Clara, the young medic, had taken on the role of running group therapy sessions. She wasn't a counselor by training, but she had a natural ability to listen, and the veterans respected her for it. Ben, ever the handyman, helped with repairs and maintenance, making sure that everything stayed in working order. One evening, Jack sat in the main room of the shelter, watching as the veterans interacted with one another. They were playing cards, telling stories, and laughing. It was the kind of camaraderie Jack hadn't seen since his own days in the service. It was almost as if, through the work he had put into the shelter, he had managed to give these men and women a piece of what they had lost. But as much as things had changed for the better, there was still a lingering feeling of apprehension. Jack knew this wasn't the end, not for him, not for the shelter, and certainly not for the people who had come to rely on it. As the shelter began to gain more recognition, it attracted attention, not all of it welcome. Some of the local politicians began to take an interest, and Jack could sense that their intentions weren't as pure as the VA's. Still, for the moment, Jack focused on what was in front of him. The shelter was thriving. The veterans were thriving. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he had done something right. But not everyone in the town was thrilled with the shelter's success. Jack had worked hard to turn the farm into a place that could support the veterans, but as the shelter grew, so did its visibility. The local land developers who had long eyed Jack's property began to circle like vultures. They had been quiet for a while, but now that the shelter was fully operational and drawing attention, they were starting to make their moves. One afternoon, as Jack was finishing up in the fields, a black car pulled up to the gate. It was a sleek vehicle, out of place in the small rural town. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward the gate, curiosity gnawing at him. As he reached the car, a man in a suit stepped out, looking every bit the part of a corporate executive. "Mr. Turner," the man asked, extending a hand. "My name is Gregory Harris. I represent the Montgomery Development Group. We've been watching your progress here and we're quite impressed with what you've done." Jack shook his hand, though he had a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Thank you, but I'm not interested in selling." Harris smiled politely, but there was something in his eyes that made Jack uneasy. "I understand, but I think we can work something out. Your farm is in a prime location for our new development project. We'd be willing to offer you a substantial sum for the land. With the shelter here, you're going to need more resources anyway, right?" Jack stood still for a moment, his mind racing. The offer was tempting. It was everything he had worked for, the chance to get out from under the burden of the mortgage, the chance to retire and never worry again. But the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't sell. Not now. Not after everything he had built. "I'm not selling," Jack said, his voice firm. Harris's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "I think you'll change your mind, Mr. Turner. Everyone has a price." Jack watched as Harris climbed back into the car, his mind in turmoil. As the car drove away, Jack felt the weight of the world press down on him again. He had built something here, a place for the veterans, for people who had nowhere else to go. But now, it seemed like the shelter itself had become a target. The weeks following Harris's visit were tense. Jack spent more time on the phone than he ever had before, talking with lawyers, with the VA, with local community leaders who supported the shelter. Every day, there was a new challenge, and it felt like the developers were inching closer to getting what they wanted. But Jack wasn't one to back down easily. He had built this shelter from the ground up, using his own blood, sweat, and tears, and there was no way he was going to let anyone take it from him. He began rallying the veterans, getting them involved in the fight to protect the shelter and the land. The very same men and women who had once felt forgotten by society were now standing together, united in a cause that meant everything to them. The town began to take notice. Word spread that Jack Turner wasn't going down without a fight, and soon, other locals who had supported the shelter in smaller ways began to show up in force. The community meetings were packed, with people speaking out against the development and in favor of keeping the shelter intact. The developers, sensing the growing opposition, tried to escalate their efforts. They brought in legal teams and political influence, using every tactic they could think of to sway public opinion. But Jack, along with the veterans and the townspeople, stood their ground. They marched, they rallied, and they made sure their voices were heard. In the end, it was the sheer power of the community that won out. The developers, unable to sway public opinion, backed down. The shelter remained standing, and Jack's farm stayed in his hands. The veterans who had found a home in the shelter stood beside him, not just as beneficiaries of his kindness, but as warriors in their own right, ready to fight for what they had earned. Jack had won, but more than that, he had built something that couldn't be taken away, a place where veterans could find refuge, and a place where they could rebuild their lives. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle. As Jack stood there, looking out over the shelter and the land that he had fought so hard to keep, he knew that this was just the beginning. The veterans who had come to him for help had become his family, and together, they had created something that would last, a legacy that no one could ever take away.